Section 1 of Confessions, Volumes 1 and 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. Confessions, Volumes 1 and 2, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Anonymously translated. Section 1. Volume 1. I have entered upon a performance which is without example, whose accomplishment will have no imitator. I mean to present my fellow mortals with a man in all the integrity of nature, and this man shall be myself. I know my heart and have studied mankind. I am not made like any one I have been acquainted with, perhaps like no one in existence. If not better, I at least claim originality. And whether nature did wisely in breaking the mould with which she formed me, can only be determined after having read this work. Whenever the last trumpet shall sound, I will present myself before the sovereign judge with this book in my hand, and loudly proclaim, thus have I acted, these were my thoughts, such was I. With equal freedom and veracity have I related what was laudable or wicked. I have concealed no crimes, added no virtues, and if I have sometimes introduced superfluous ornament, it was merely to occupy a void occasioned by defect of memory. I may have supposed that certain which I only knew to be probable, but have never asserted as truth a conscious falsehood. Such as I was, I have declared myself, sometimes vile and despicable, at others virtuous, generous and sublime. Even as thou hast read my inmost soul, power eternal, assemble round thy throne an innumerable throng of my fellow mortals, let them listen to my confessions, let them blush at my depravity, let them tremble at my sufferings, let each in his turn expose with equal sincerity the failings, the wanderings of his heart, and if he dare, aver I was better than that man. I was born at Geneva in 1712, son of Isaac Rousseau and Suzanne Bernard, citizens. My father's share of a moderate competency, which was divided among 15 children, being very trivial, his business of a watchmaker, in which he had the reputation of great ingenuity, was his only dependence. My mother's circumstances were more affluent. She was daughter of a Monsieur Bernard, minister, and possessed a considerable share of modesty and beauty. Indeed, my father found some difficulty in obtaining her hand. The affection they entertained for each other was almost as early as their existence. At 8 or 9 years old, they walked together every evening on the banks of the Treille, and before they were 10, could not support the idea of separation. A natural sympathy of soul confined those sentiments of predilection which habit at first produced. Born with minds susceptible of the most exquisite sensibility and tenderness, it was only necessary to encounter similar dispositions. That moment fortunately presented itself, and each surrendered a willing heart. The obstacles that opposed served only to give a degree of vivacity to their affection, and the young lover, not being able to obtain his mistress, was overwhelmed with sorrow and despair. She advised him to travel, to forget her. He consented. He travelled, but returned more passionate than ever, and had the happiness to find her equally constant, equally tender. After this proof of mutual affection, what could they resolve? To dedicate their future lives to love. The resolution was ratified with a vow, on which heaven shed its benediction. Fortunately, my mother's brother, Gabriel Bernard, fell in love with one of my father's sisters. She had no objection to the match, but made the marriage of his sister with her brother an indispensable preliminary. Love soon removed every obstacle, and the two weddings were celebrated the same day. Thus my uncle became the husband of my aunt, and their children were doubly cousins german. Before a year was expired, both had the happiness to become fathers, but were soon after obliged to submit to a separation. My uncle Bernard, who was an engineer, went to serve in the Empire and Hungary under Prince Eugene, and distinguished himself both at the siege and battle of Belgrade. My father, after the birth of my only brother, set off on recommendation for Constantinople, and was appointed watchmaker to the Seraglio. During his absence, the beauty, wit, and accomplishments of my mother attracted a number of admirers, among whom Monsieur de la Closure, Resident of France, was the most assiduous in his attentions. His passion must have been extremely violent, since after a period of 30 years I have seen him affected at the very mention of her name. My mother had a defense more powerful even than her virtue. She tenderly loved my father, and conjured him to return. His inclination seconding his request, he gave up every prospect of emolument, and hastened to Geneva. I was the unfortunate fruit of this return, being born 10 months after, in a very weakly and infirm state. My birth cost my mother her life, and was the first of my misfortunes. I am ignorant how my father supported her loss at that time, but I know he was ever after inconsolable. In me, he still thought he saw her he so tenderly lamented, but could never forget I had been the innocent cause of his misfortune. Nor did he ever embrace me, but his sighs, the convulsive pressure of his arms, witnessed that a bitter regret mingled itself with his caresses, though, as may be supposed, they were not on this account less ardent. When he said to me, "Jean-Jacques, let us talk of your mother," my usual reply was, "Yes, father, but then you know we shall cry," and immediately the tears started from his eyes. "Ah!" exclaimed he, with agitation, "give me back my wife. At least console me for her loss. fill up, dear boy, the void she has left in my soul. Could I love thee thus, wert thou only my son?" 40 years after this loss he expired in the arms of his second wife, but the name of the first still vibrated on his lips, still was her image engraved on his heart. Such were the authors of my being. Of all the gifts it had pleased Heaven to bestow on them, a feeling heart was the only one that descended to me. This had been the source of their felicity. It was the foundation of all my misfortunes. I came into the world with so few signs of life that they entertained but little hope of preserving me. With the seeds of a disorder that has gathered strength with years, and from which I am now relieved at intervals, only to suffer a different, though more intolerable evil. I owed my preservation to one of my father's sisters, an amiable and virtuous girl, who took the most tender care of me. She is yet living, nursing at the age of 80 a husband younger than herself, but worn out with excessive drinking. Dear aunt, I freely forgive your having preserved my life, and only lament that it is not in my power to bestow on the decline of your days the tender solicitude and care you lavished on the first dawn of mine. My nurse, Jacqueline, is likewise living, and in good health. The hands that opened my eyes to the light of this world may close them at my death. We suffer before we think. It is the common lot of humanity. I experienced more than my proportion of it. I have no knowledge of what passed prior to my 5th or 6th year. I recollect nothing of learning to read. I only remember what effect the first considerable exercise of it produced on my mind, and from that moment I date an uninterrupted knowledge of myself. Every night after supper we read some part of a small collection of romances which had been my mother's. My father's design was only to improve me in reading, and he thought these entertaining works were calculated to give me a fondness for it. But we soon found ourselves so interested in the adventures they contained, that we alternately read whole nights together, and could not bear to give over until at the conclusion of a volume. Sometimes in a morning, on hearing the swallows at our window, my father, quite ashamed of this weakness, would cry, "Come, come, let us go to bed. I am more a child than thou art." I soon acquired, by this dangerous custom, not only an extreme facility in reading and comprehending, but, for my age, a too intimate acquaintance with the passions. An infinity of sensations were familiar to me, without possessing any precise idea of the objects to which they related. I had conceived nothing, I had felt the whole. This confused succession of emotions did not retard the future efforts of my reason, though they added an extravagant, romantic notion of human life, which experience and reflection have never been able to eradicate. My romance reading concluded with the summer of 1719. The following winter was differently employed. My mother's library being quite exhausted, we had recourse to that part of her father's which had devolved to us. Here we happily found some valuable books, which was by no means extraordinary, having been selected by a minister that truly deserved that title, in whom learning, which was the rage of the times, was but a secondary commendation, his taste and good sense being most conspicuous. The History of the Church and Empire by Le Sueur, Bossuet's Discourses on Universal History, Plutarch's Lives, the History of Venice by Nani, Ovid's Metamorphoses, La Bruyere, Fontenelle's World, his Dialogues of the Dead, and a few volumes of Moliere, were soon ranged in my father's closet, where, during the hours he was employed in his business, I daily read them, with an avidity and taste uncommon, perhaps unprecedented, at my age. Plutarch presently became my greatest favorite. The satisfaction I derived from repeated readings I gave this author extinguished my passion for romances, and I shortly preferred Agesilaus, Brutus, and Aristides to Orondates, Artamene, and Juba. These interesting studies, seconded by the conversations they frequently occasioned with my father, produced that republican spirit and love of liberty, that haughty and invincible turn of mind, which rendered me impatient of restraint or servitude, and became the torment of my life, as I continually found myself in situations incompatible with these sentiments. Incessantly occupied with Rome and Athens, conversing, if I may so express myself, with their illustrious heroes, born the citizen of a republic, of a father whose ruling passion was a love of his country, I was fired with these examples, could fancy myself a Greek or Roman, and readily give into the character of the personage whose life I read. Transported by the recital of any extraordinary instance of fortitude or intrepidity, animation flashed from my eyes, and gave my voice additional strength and energy. One day at table, while relating the fortitude of Scaevola, they were terrified at seeing me start from my seat and hold my hand over a hot chafing dish, to represent more forcibly the action of that determined Roman. My brother, who was 7 years older than myself, was brought up to my father's profession. The extraordinary affection they lavished on me might be the reason he was too much neglected. This certainly was a fault which cannot be justified. His education and morals suffered by this neglect, and he acquired the habits of a libertine before he arrived at an age to be really one. My father tried what effect placing him with a master would produce, but he still persisted in the same ill conduct. Though I saw him so seldom that it could hardly be said we were acquainted, I loved him tenderly, and believe he had as strong an affection for me as a youth of his dissipated turn of mind could be supposed capable of. One day, I remember, when my father was correcting him severely, I threw myself between them, embracing my brother, whom I covered with my body, receiving the strokes designed for him. I persisted so obstinately in my protection, that, either softened by my cries and tears, or fearing to hurt me most, his anger subsided, and he pardoned his fault. In the end, my brother's conduct became so bad that he suddenly disappeared, and we learned some time after that he was in Germany. But he never wrote to us, and from that day we heard no news of him. Thus I became an only son. If this poor lad was neglected, it was quite different with his brother, for the children of a king could not be treated with more attention and tenderness than were bestowed on my infancy, being the darling of the family, and, what is rather uncommon, though treated as a beloved, never a spoiled child, was never permitted, while under paternal inspection, to play in the street with other children, never had any occasion to contradict or indulge those fantastical humours which are usually attributed to nature, but are in reality the effects of an injudicious education. I had the faults common to my age, was talkative, a glutton, and sometimes a liar, made no scruple of stealing sweetmeats, fruits, or indeed any kind of eatables, but never took delight in mischievous waste, in accusing others, or tormenting harmless animals. I recollect, indeed, that one day, while Madame Clos, a neighbour of ours, was gone to church, I made water in her kettle. The remembrance even now makes me smile, for Madame Clos, though, if you please, a good sort of creature, was one of the most tedious, grumbling old women I ever knew. Thus have I given a brief but faithful history of my childish transgressions. End of Section 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.